Hi, Wendy.
Hi.
Thank you very much again for agreeing to be grilled by me as part of our Equaliser series of women who work in the sports industry or in a role that impacts in some shape or form women's sport and the future of women's sport. And given I know what you do and where you work, you seem like the obvious person to speak to. But I know what you do and where you work, but why don't you explain for the purpose of the interview?
No, absolutely sure. Thank you. Thank you for inviting me here. Pleasure to be here. I'm the head of engagement and communications at Women in Sport. And Women in Sport is a charity that seeks to find equal play for women and girls in sport. There's a big gender gap in women's participation from the elite right the way down to the grassroots. And so my role at the charity is to look at how we communicate the problem and the solutions that we can all work together to get to. And also in terms of engagement, how do we engage with people to both provide their voice as advocates for what we're there and what we stand for in terms of what we do as a charity, but also to raise money, because as a charity we're reliant on both voluntary income from supporters like you, us, the corporate world, but also the government world as well. We work really closely with Sport England to deliver a lot of our work as well.
Mm-hmm. Would you like to explain, maybe using some working examples of the sort of initiatives you're currently involved in?
Yeah, sure. One of the most exciting initiatives that actually Sport England do fund is our Daughters and Dads programme. And that actually is a really great programme that unfortunately sets the scene of where the problem starts. And often the problem will start as young as 7 years old. So this programme seeks to tackle gender stereotypes within the family, and often within the family you might not always realise those gender stereotypes are there, but what we seek to do through that programme is to work with families that perhaps would spend a lot of time perhaps supporting their sons in being sporty, particularly team sports. And what we do is turn it on its head to really look at how dads and their daughters can spend some quality time in that environment too. So we tackle that through an 11-week programme, working with the EFL Foundation across the country through football, to kind of understand what the fundamental movement skills for playing football, at the same time really addressing how you can just have time together as a daughter and dad, do things like rough and tumble, and really unpick some of the things that create these early stereotypes, the things you say, pinkification. So the dads wear blue t-shirts, the girls wear the dads wear pink t-shirts, the girls wear blue t-shirts, and then to also really start to be active together in a regular way, so that it forms part of their daily activities. So that's on the ground. That's a great initiative that sort of starts really young. On the other end of the spectrum, we look at the culture of sport as well. So working very much across the sporting world, both at the elite level and at the grassroots level, to really understand how we can disrupt the culture of sport, which is very male dominated, has a system in place that isn't equal for men and women, particularly at the top. But there's, interesting, there's been a great announcement with the FA today that's just announced their first female chair. So for us, that's a great win in starting to really shift the momentum in what you see is what you believe. So if you can get the diversity of thought and voice right at the top, then that can filter down and start to show the girls with their dads what they can aspire to be. So so we do a lot, and core to a lot of that is being really authentic in understanding what those issues are. So we do a huge amount of insight and research into understanding what the barriers are at lots of different across lots of different sports, but also across lots of different age ranges, as we've referenced in terms of the early ages, but through teenage years, for instance, through pregnancy, through midlife and menopause, and understanding what we can do to really build confidence in women and girls to be active every day and make it part of their long-term kind of commitment to their health, to their confidence, to their resilience, to their leadership skills, and their future career.
So there's obviously been a lot of positive progress for women's sport in relatively kind of recent years. There's now professional contracts being awarded at the elite level. Certain corporates have come in and made some headline sponsors of women's sports event. There's a lot more women's sport on the TV. And leagues, for that matter, competitions being launched of late. But there's obviously clearly a lot more work that needs to be done, and not just at the elite level, but also kind of, as you say, from at a grassroots basis. What do you see as the main hurdles at the moment that you need to get over as an organisation, or maybe that women's sport need to get over in order to see the sort of progress you'd like to see?
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it was interesting since the Football World Cup 2019, I think it is now. Yeah. It's difficult to remember in between what's happened with the pandemic, but there was this real sort of momentum and a crest of a wave in terms of women's sport because, of course, the audience numbers. There was real momentum behind the team. The conversation was about how it had very much professionalized the skills of the game, and the players were fantastic, and there were sponsors behind that, and the coverage was amazing. I remember actually sitting watching it with my two sons, my husband, my dad, other neighbours. There was this real momentum, and then of course, unfortunately, the pandemic happened, and sport just has, across the board for men and women, sport has stopped. And I think the last year and a half, on the one hand, has been awful and catastrophic for the sector, but actually it's really highlighted, I think, the issue even more, and the fragility of women's sport. And so we at Women's Sport have done a lot in terms of trying to continue to raise that visibility, and to make sure that the plans that a lot of the national governing bodies have put in place to make sure that programming for women was still absolutely going to be there, to make sure that once we were out of this pandemic, that it continues. And the commitment from our conversations with all those important bodies was absolutely there, and it was really humbling to hear those conversations. But of course, the priority was still put into the men's game coming back first, and I think that's the piece that we need to keep considering. How do we really take time to invest in women's sport for the long term, not just for the short term? Because it's a fantastic product to carry forward, and not necessarily in the way that the men or the men's game is created. It doesn't have to be the same as that. And actually, I think we're beginning to see that there is some real interest in a different kind of product, not only in terms of how it's played and the types of sort of personalities that are involved at that professional level, but what girls are actually asking for and aspiring to be as well at that grassroots. So there are three big things I think we look at women's sport. It's about, and they're all entwined, and it's a very complex issue to be kind of changing. I mean, I would love to be able to say here, our biggest ambition is that women in sport no longer exists, but I think we do have a long battle. I mean, if you think back, it took 50 years before the FA allowed women to play football again. And if you think back, it wasn't until 1973 that women could run the marathon. So it's not a quick fix with a lot of these things, but there is movement in the right direction, and visibility absolutely has increased. So we did some research 3 years ago that said at the height of women's sport, it would go up to 10% of media coverage, usually the Olympics, big international events. Outside of that, it was 2-3%. It's so small. It's beginning to rise. So Sky, BBC are really investing time into profiling women's games. So for instance, both BBC and Sport will be profiling the 100, the new cricket competition that has both equal pay for men and women and equal coverage as well. Fantastic. It's and prize money, equal prize money. So that's fantastic news. We've still got to go a long way to, I think, also make sure that it's on every newspaper back page, that it's there. You know, wouldn't it be great to start seeing a constant feed of women's sport that everyone is tapping into daily? So I still think there is a lot to do there. The Telegraph also is a great example of a women's sport platform that showcases elite but also issue-based stories around some of the challenges that you might have as a woman in sport, around, for instance, maternity leave, around pregnancy, around the taboo subjects of periods and coaching. So there is a lot in that space. I think we just need to keep accelerating in that and keep pushing on visibility. It's also about investment, and of course those are both entwined. So you'll get the investment if there's more visibility and if there's more spectators and more audiences and if we can fill the stadiums. So the fact again that we're seeing brands investing, so Women in Sport work with Vitality as part of trying to develop their sort of thought leadership in this space, as one of the leading brands that are investing really heavily across different sports. And I think brands, because have seen during the pandemic a product that's completely been taken away, they're starting to see and think about actually where are those opportunities. And I think there will be lots of opportunities that will begin to develop as we come back into the sporting arena post-pandemic, because I think women's sport isn't just watched by women. In actual fact, it is watched a lot by men, but there are more families that will watch women's sport. So for instance, the 100 is very much targeted to a family audience, and with that is the opportunity to build a brand profile that's quite different to where brands have been built before if they sponsor that sporting game, competition or athlete. And then obviously with that, it's all interconnected, because if you can't see it to believe it, if there isn't the visibility there, how do you aspire girls to dream to be an elite athlete? So we did some work actually with Sports Direct to really kind of ask girls and boys what their aspirations were, and half as many girls as boys aspired to reach the top. And so that's 30% of girls aspired to reach the top, 60% of boys aspired to reach the top in the sporting world. We want girls to dream as much as boys, and I think that statistic demonstrates we're not quite doing enough. And so, you know, there's lots of different ways that we can do that through the visibility, but it's also about the opportunity on the ground, and how do you give the opportunity on the ground? Through schools, through clubs, through investment is really important going forward.
Right. And I guess taking it away, I guess from just women in sport, let's talk about, I mean, have you always worked in sport? So sort of talking about you and your not necessarily your role within women's sport, but within sport generally.
No, I haven't. In actual fact, if I go back to what my dream was to be, actually, was to be Kate Adie, a war zone journalist. Okay. Very different to where I am then, but she was my aspiration. I'm not quite sure where that drive came from, but probably hours of an old-fashioned typewriter writing stories. So journalism was what I wanted to do. And actually, I ended up going into sort of like an advertising agency, and very early on got a bit of a social conscience. Felt like I was selling too much sort of Madewell cheese and Nokia phones randomly were the products that I was in charge of, and decided that very early on in my career that actually I had a bit of a social purpose and conscience. So I actually moved over into the charity sector about 25 years ago. My first job was working for the NSPCC for the Full Stop campaign to end child abuse. So quite a hard, gritty charity. Interestingly, sport fair touched me very briefly there when I managed to secure a big partnership with Labrooks and worked alongside, was it Gabby Yoreth was her maiden name, who then became Gabby Logan, and we did lots of work at Ascot with her, raising lots of money for the Full Stop campaign. So perhaps there was a bit of a sporting influence there, and then moved into homelessness. So worked for a charity called Crisis, which was actually a phenomenal charity that utilised the Millennium Dome at Christmas time for homeless people to use, to at least be able to find housing and food and a haircut over Christmas. So we utilised the Millennium Dome post-millennium, and it was a fantastic space, but was a huge challenge to get that set up over Christmas. There was a bit of sport there, but not a huge amount. And then I moved to Catch 22, which was a youth offending charity that had a big programme called Positive Futures, interestingly. And I think it was then that really engaged in the power of sport for social good. Positive Futures was a big programme that helped ex-offenders to be really focused and re-engage in their community through playing football, being part of a team, managing the football programme, and really understanding how camaraderie and your social networks can keep you out of trouble. Interestingly, very focused on boys rather than girls, but actually is a really strong message for us at Women in Sport in terms of why is it that often boys are kept out of trouble through sport, whereas girls often internalise their trouble, and unfortunately that's where they would drop out of sport. So interestingly, being part of that has probably planted a seed somewhere. I then went to work at a very different charity, an environment charity called Canal and River Trust, that runs all the canals and rivers across the UK. And that's where I think it was a turning point for me. I worked with Sport England and a big major donor to launch a coast-to-coast canal and canoe trail, which was 162 miles from Liverpool to Gaul. I do still need to go back and do it. I didn't make it, but I do need to go back and do the whole thing. But its emphasis was as it ran across different communities, particularly in the north, where there was a lot of disadvantage and disengaged communities. The whole point was to use something that's on your doorstep as a way to be active, and it supported 10,000 kids to be active on their waterways, to then engage them, inspire them to do more, such as get into long-term education and employment. So having worked with Sport England, suddenly the work at Women's in Sport started to emerge, and I became much more knowledgeable about the sporting sector, and then came to Women in Sport. So there must have been a journey there, or fate, that was my destiny in some way, and I absolutely love it. It's a fantastic charity, small but very mighty is all I can.
Have you always had an interest in sport?
I have. I was an only child, so I think my mum sent me off on every type of sporting activity she could possibly fit into my day. And I was a bit of a swimmer, so I swam county level for Kent. Backstroke was my stroke, interestingly, which has a connection to something I'll tell you about later. But I also did dance. I played netball, so my team sport was very much netball. And I also I took up horse riding as well. So lots of different strings to my bow. Swimming, I think, is possibly my passion. And interestingly, Becky Adlington is our patron at Women in Sport too. So that's a bit of an inspiration for me to be working with her.
And now having found a role that, I'm not saying all your previous roles you weren't obviously very passionate about, but having found a role now that obviously you're clearly enjoying enormously, very passionate about, and also being able to combine your passion for sport generally, what sort of advice, guidance, tips would you give to, say, yourself of 20 years ago, or for someone coming through maybe the university now who has a passion for sport? What sort of advice would you give them in terms of getting involved in the industry, getting involved in particularly your charitable sector? Entry points, or if you were to do it again, how would you change anything?
Would I be a Kate AD? I don't think, probably not, possibly not. I don't think I would. But to me, that passion for your job is the bit, I think. If you can find that passion, it doesn't become a job. I mean, let's face it, working for women in sport has to be a hobby, doesn't it? It's just, it's in my DNA in terms of everything I stand for. And actually, friends, family say that to me. You're in a role that just is probably suits you so well. But to me, it's about passion for your job, because I think it's not easy working for the charity sector. You're often on a shoestring, budgets aren't huge. There's tough causes, and that's probably one of the most challenging elements of the job, is that it's some heart-wrenching situations that people are in, but what keeps you passionate is that hope for change, and that you want to make that change. So if you can find something that you're truly passionate about, I think that's very important. I also think, I wonder, actually, in this climate, what I've learned through the last year and a half is, when everything is turned on its head, sometimes that's a good thing. So going through a global pandemic, it makes you think afresh and makes you look at things differently. And we've had to be very agile. Working at women's sport is and in the sport industry, you have to be quite agile. It's a very fast moving industry. And being able to think on your feet, act quickly, and sometimes take some risks, actually is quite invigorating, because the risks will often pay off, and it now allows you to do something different, or to make a more of an impact than you perhaps had thought. So I possibly would say take more risks in my younger self. Try things out, think differently, and it's never wrong, is it? You learn a lot from perhaps mistakes, but it's never wrong if you've taken a risk. I shouldn't be saying this though to a
not to a lawyer.
A lawyer.
We get paid to prevent them. No, I agree. I agree in terms of taking a risk from a personal career perspective and trying things out, and particularly if it's to try something out, so you combine your career with your passion, and yeah, as you say, giving it a try.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move away maybe from just career talk then, and maybe we'll come back to women's sport in a moment. But what then through your, actually again, so taking it away from career, but what would you consider to be some of your greatest achievements, whether women's sport or otherwise, or let's say professionally or otherwise?
So across my career, it comes back again to sort of social purpose. And I think you can talk about big projects, big investments, big supporters, but actually what it comes down to is the stories and the change that have been made to people's lives. So I talked about daughters and dads earlier, and there's a great quote from a dad that just said he was blindfolded before he came onto our programme in how he could engage and support his daughter in being active. I've worked with kids that just didn't have any respect for their local community. They started developing their skills on water with a canoe and a paddle, and they were so inspired. They then went back to school and took their GCSEs and were inspired again to, be back in that community. So I think it's about how the difference you make to people's lives. That's the bit that gets me up in the morning, to really, know that there's a difference being made. Then on a non sort of career side of things, this year I've taken up cold water swimming, and it's got me through lockdown. I'm lucky enough to live by the sea. I've lived by the sea for about 17 years, but I just didn't decide to spend much of my time in the sea. Now, I went to the swimming pool that carried on with, perhaps as a child, as a teenager swimming, but cold water swimming, I managed to get down to freezing in the winter, and with this brilliant community of other cold water swimmers, which seems to have expanded rapidly in the last 12 months, because I think everyone felt they needed to be released to the water too in some way to get them through these times. And I'm hooked. And all I wear, so I don't wear a swimming costume, a wetsuit. I wear a swimming costume. I don't wear a wetsuit. I wear gloves. I wear.
You don't wear a wetsuit?
I don't wear a wetsuit.
In freezing, literally freezing weather?
Freezing, yeah. It got to 0 degrees. It was snowing. There was snow on the beach, and it was 0 degrees. A bobble hat, neoprene boots, and I absolutely love it. So it's a bit like a religion. It's helped us all in lots of many ways in this bonkers sort of situation we've been in, and I'm pleased. It's now up to 19 degrees in the sea, and that feels like bath water in comparison to January.
You're looking around the beach thinking, where were all you back in January?
Exactly.
All these newbies.
But I'd say that's a pretty good achievement for me this year.
I'll ask the obvious question. When you jump into the water and it's snowing outside, I mean, how quickly do you warm up? I mean, do you warm up? Do you just take 30 seconds and then you're away, or do you have a moment of absolute pain?
Yeah, I'd say it's a good minute of absolute pain.
Okay.
A lot of short breaths, the odd swearing. Then I get this sort of like almost pins and needles at the back of my neck, and then this elation. It's like the best endorphins that you can get in, under 2 minutes. I could stay in there, but then the trick is not to stay in for too long, because then that's not good in terms of elements of hypothermia and things like that. So the rule of judgment is depending on the temperature. When it was 0 degrees, I would be in for probably 4 or 5 minutes max, absolute max, and then it's a quick kind of run back and escape the cold winds as well, and a dry robe helped, and hot
coffee,
yeah, and a quick home. So but now I went for a swim just yesterday, and I'm half an hour in the water now doing some proper swimming, goggles and front crawl.
Well done you, that's amazing. What a thing to do at lockdown. Great new skill. Excellent.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually it helped. We showcased some stories from women who at midlife age. There's interestingly, the representation of women in their sort of 40s and 50s, particularly going through the menopause. If you look online or in Getty Images, who we now work with, there was nothing. There would be a ticking clock, which really oozes confidence and engagement, motivate women to get active, or very angry looking women. And so working with Getty Images, we created these brilliant stories. And one of the stories was, as we call her, Cold Catherine, a friend of mine who does cold water swimming, and try to express through imagery the feeling of what that experience creates, which is basically a mini little adventure every day. And it doesn't have to be competitive. It's about community. It doesn't have to be about medals. It's actually about friendship and what you can achieve by stepping in cold water. And it's all about moments of pride. And that's the piece that gets women of that age motivated to be more active. Now, lots of other women will be competitive and it will be about the medals, but for some women going through the menopause, it's a really tricky time in terms of confidence, hormones, your health, your bones, osteoporosis. So we created this great imagery and this great feel. And we now have about 600 photographs on Getty Image Gallery that can be used by and licensed to sporting industry, brands, the media industry, the marketing industry, to actually really shake up how women at that age are portrayed. So we have cold water swimmers, we have skateboarders, we have footballers, we have runners, we have yoga instructors. It's completely transformed what you would usually see, which is a really important part of our work as well, to take away the stigma and the taboo at certain ages of what you can and what you can't do, and inspire other people.
And what you should look like and what you should be wearing and all the rest of it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Brilliant. Well, I'm conscious of time, so I think I warned you about this already, but I think we have for all of our interviews as part of this series, a quick fire. So you're not allowed to think of the answers. You may have already thought of the answers, but a quick fire response to the following, if you're ready.
Okay, let's do it.
Right. Sun or snow?
Snow.
Horror or rom-com?
Bit scared of horrors now. I think it'd have to be rom-com.
Okay. Wine or beer? Or neither?
Oh, wine.
Favourite city?
Oh, that's a difficult one, isn't it? Cape Town.
One that wasn't on the list. If bucket list, sports event bucket list.
Oh, let's say Olympics in at Tokyo. Let's do that.
Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah.
And finally, the song that gets you on the dance floor.
Well, it would have to be a David Bowie. Any track, David Bowie. Rebel, Rebel. Let's take that one.
Excellent. I agree. Excellent. Thank you so much. We sort of caught so much there in terms of women in sport, your career, open water swimming, what you do in your lockdown, and really appreciative of the time. It's much, much appreciated. And this will be shown on our channels shortly with a selection of, well, not a selection, but a range of lots of different important women working in sport.
Brilliant. Thank you. Come water swimming, cold water swimming anytime, Julian.
I'm not that brave. Maybe in the summer. I could come in the summer.